The chandeliers in the Four Seasons ballroom glowed like captured stars, scattering light across the marble floor. A jazz trio played softly near the grand piano, their notes curling through the air like smoke. I walked in alone, 36 years old, wearing a black satin dress that felt too sharp for the warmth of the room. My heels clicked once, twice before the hum of conversation swallowed the sound. 36, I whispered under my breath. And tonight, I'm just the guest no one wanted. That line echoed in my head as I caught the first wave of glances. Some polite, some pitying, a few simply curious as if I were an uninvited roomer that had somehow taken human form. At the far end of the ballroom, I saw him. My father, Richard Hayes, towering behind the podium like a general addressing his troops. The founder of Hayes Manufacturing, the man the business pages still called the Iron Hand of Chicago. Beside him stood my younger brother Andrew, grinning like a politician on election night. He was 33, handsome, confident, and newly married to the daughter of a state senator. The perfect heir. The one who had never been told no. A woman at the next table leaned toward her friend. "I thought she wasn't invited," she whispered, glancing at me as if I couldn't hear. I smiled faintly. "Neither did I." I murmured and took a slow sip of champagne. The bubbles bit at my tongue, sharp and cold. When the band stopped, the room shifted toward the stage. My father adjusted the microphone, his voice filling every inch of the ballroom. "Tonight," he said, "is not just a wedding. It's a celebration of legacy, of family, of what we've built together." Applause rippled through the crowd. I felt my stomach tighten. He continued, "After 40 years, Hayes Manufacturing has been sold for $98 million. His voice swelled with pride. "Andrew will carry that legacy forward as he should. He's earned it." I could feel the words before they reached me. A pause, a small, deliberate turn of his head. And as for Victoria, he said, his eyes finding mine, "You're getting nothing." It came out smooth, almost elegant, the cruelty hidden under a businessman's calm. Laughter fluttered around the tables, uneasy, nervous, but real. Champagne glasses clinked. Somewhere in the back, a guest muttered, "Always so dramatic." My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass. For a moment, I thought I might actually hear the crack. The sound of my own pulse filled my ears, steady and low like distant thunder. But my face didn't move. I lifted my chin and watched him bask in his applause. His suit was perfectly pressed, his tie the color of old money. Everything about him was designed to look untouchable. I wondered if he noticed how quiet the music had become. Across the table, an older relative leaned toward me. "He didn't mean it, dear. You know how fathers are." I turned to her, smiling softly. "Yes, I said I do." I glanced at Andrew, his hand resting on his bride's, both of them glowing under the chandelier's light. To them, this was victory. To me, it was confirmation. I looked down at my champagne. The light from above fractured across the surface like broken glass. For a heartbeat, I saw the reflection of a girl I used to be. The one who thought she just had to work harder to be seen. My chest tightened, but the corners of my mouth curved upward. "Many years," I whispered under my breath, "and he still hasn't changed." I stood. The sound of my chair sliding against marble drew a few glances. My father stopped mid-sentence, blinking in annoyance. I raised my glass. My voice, calm and clear, carried across the room. "That's quite an accomplishment, Dad. $98 million. Congratulations." He nodded, stiffly uncertain. "Thank you, Victoria." "But," I said, tilting my head, "I think you might have sold the wrong company." The silence was immediate. A single note from the piano hung in the air unfinished before fading away. Faces turned toward me, confusion tightening the room like a wire. My father's expression didn't change, but his jaw flexed once. "What are you talking about?" he asked, still into the microphone. I just smiled. "You'll see." For a moment, no one breathed. The chandeliers hummed faintly above us. Then I set my glass down, calm as stone, and the faintest smile tugged at my lips. Cold, deliberate, inevitable. Across the room, my father's gaze hardened. In that frozen silence with the music dead and the laughter gone, I knew I had his attention for the first time in my life, and that was enough for tonight. The memory started with the hum of the air conditioner and the faint smell of polished wood. I was 22, sitting across from my father in the small conference room of our family's suburban mansion outside Chicago, clutching a folder that had taken me 3 months to prepare. The blueprint of a new production line. My idea, my chance to show him I wasn't just decoration in his empire. He skimmed 2 pages, then leaned back, expression carved in stone. "You've been studying too much theory, Victoria," he said, his voice flat. "Marketing communications, those are things a woman can lead. Manufacturing isn't your lane." I tried to laugh it off, the kind of nervous sound you make when you still hope to be heard. "It's not theory, Dad. If we automate the supply chain the way I mapped here, we could cut costs by 12% in a year." From the corner of the room, Andrew chuckled. He was 20 at the time, a finance major, home for the summer, all charm and easy confidence. "Come on, Vic," he said, "this isn't one of your class projects." My father smiled at him, that proud, approving smile I had chased my whole life. Then he turned to me again. "Sweetheart, you're not listening. It's a nice thought, but leave the engineering to the men who built this company." That was the moment the air left my chest. I looked down at my folder, the neat columns of data blurring together. "I understand," I said quietly. He didn't notice the tremor in my voice. He was already reaching for the phone on his desk, calling in his assistant. I walked out of that room feeling smaller than I had in years. Later that evening, the house glowed with music and laughter. My father was hosting a company dinner to celebrate another profitable quarter. Crystal glasses chimed. Men in dark suits filled the living room, shaking hands under chandeliers. I hovered near the doorway, unsure if I belonged. Richard Hayes raised his glass. To Andrew, he said, smiling at my brother, the future of Hayes Manufacturing. I took a step forward, just enough for him to see me. His eyes slid past mine as if I were a stranger holding a tray. One of the guests, a balding executive from St. Louis, chuckled. "And what about your daughter, Richard? The smart one from Boston?" My father grinned. "Ah, yes. Victoria's bright. A real thinker. Loves theory more than practice." Laughter rippled through the room. Something in me cracked. I turned and walked out before the tears could rise. Outside, the winter air sliced through my lungs. The yard lights cast long shadows over the snow-covered lawn. I stood on the stone steps, arms folded, trying to breathe. Behind me, the door opened with a soft click. My mother's voice drifted out. "Victoria." I turned. She stood there in her evening dress, arms wrapped in a shawl. Her face was gentle, the kind that always looked on the verge of apology. "Don't let him get to you," she said quietly. "You know how your father is." I stared at her, the cold burning in my throat. "Then why don't you ever say something?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She just shook her head, eyes wet, and reached to touch my arm. I stepped back. The silence between us stretched heavy as the clouds above. That night, I packed. It didn't take long, just 2 suitcases and the folder he'd dismissed that afternoon. My mother didn't try to stop me. She stood at the top of the stairs, watching as I wheeled my bags to the door. "Where will you go?" she asked softly. "Boston," I said. "Somewhere I can build something that's mine." I stepped out into the snow. The sky was the color of slate, and the lights from Hayes Manufacturing burned in the distance, like an empire that would never notice its missing piece. At the train station downtown, the platform was nearly empty. A late-night freight passed, first the vibration running through the concrete and into my chest. When the passenger train finally pulled in, I climbed aboard and found a seat by the window. The glass was cold against my forehead. Streetlights flashed by one after another, slicing the darkness into pieces. Each one felt like a memory severed clean. Every dinner, every conversation, every time I'd waited for my father to look at me and see more than a daughter, I whispered, "I don't know where I'm going. I just know I can't stay." Outside, Chicago disappeared behind a veil of snow. I watched until the last glimmer of the city lights sank into the horizon. Somewhere between stations, exhaustion took over. My folder slipped from my lap onto the floor. For the first time, I didn't pick it up. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the train carry me east, away from everything I knew toward a city that didn't yet know my name. The apartment in South Boston was barely more than a box. Thin walls, yellowed paint, a single window facing the alley where delivery trucks rumbled every morning. I shared the building with strangers who came and went at odd hours, and the radiator clanked like a broken heartbeat. It wasn't much, but it was mine. By day, I worked as a data analyst for a logistics firm near the harbor, buried in spreadsheets that smelled faintly of diesel and coffee. By night, I rode the Red Line to the University of Chicago Booth's Boston campus, where I studied under fluorescent lights until my eyes burned. I used to joke that I had 2 full-time jobs, earning a paycheck and rebuilding a person. There were nights when I'd come home at midnight, drop my bag on the kitchen floor, and sit in the dark for a while just to let the noise inside me settle. Then I'd open my laptop, sip cold coffee, and start typing. Plans, numbers, projections. Anything that made me feel like I was moving somewhere, even if no one else could see it. Working for someone else by day, I whispered once, staring at the glow of the screen, and learning to live for myself by night. It became my prayer. In my second semester, we got a new adjunct professor, Bamti Mainam. Grace Turner. She was in her late 40s with cropped gray blonde hair and a calmness that filled the room before she spoke. She'd once been the CEO of a major logistics startup before selling it to a Fortune 500 company. The first day she walked in, the class fell quiet. You could tell instantly she didn't teach theory. She taught survival. One evening during a case discussion about corporate ethics, Grace looked around the room and asked, "What do you do when no one believes in you? When every door shuts and every hand that should have lifted you up pushes you down instead?" Silence. I could feel her eyes on me, though she didn't know my story. She smiled faintly. "If no one believes in you," she said, "then who do you believe in?" Something in me tightened. I heard my own voice answer before I had time to think. Myself. The corner of her mouth lifted. "Then you're already ahead of half the world." After class, she stopped me in the hallway. "Hayes, isn't it? You've got a good head for logistics. Ever thought about building something of your own?" I laughed softly. "Thought about it, yes. Surviving it, that's another story." Grace tilted her head. "Then start small. Start where it scares you." That night I opened a blank document and wrote 3 words at the top: Project Summit. It started as a name for an idea. Software that could predict bottlenecks in supply chains before they happened. Nothing revolutionary, just efficient. But it was mine. The following week I reached out to an old friend from undergrad, Ethan Reynolds. Back then he was the quiet one who always sat in the back row of our economics lectures, the guy who actually read the fine print of every syllabus. Now he was an associate at a corporate law firm downtown. We met at a diner near South Station. He slid into the booth across from me, shaking off the cold. "You look like someone who hasn't slept since 2010, he said, grinning. "I've been busy," I replied. "I need help setting up something. Legally." He raised an eyebrow. A company? Or at least a name that could become one." Ethan leaned back, studying me. "Do you have investors?" "Just debt," I said. He laughed quietly, then pulled a legal pad from his briefcase. "Okay, first things first. Delaware. You want flexibility, you register there." I nodded. And for the first time it felt real. We went through pages of forms, tax clauses, incorporation structures. My hand cramped from signing, but I didn't stop. Ethan asked, "What's the name Summit Dynamics?" I said. He looked up. "Strong name. Why Summit?" "Because I said the climb is the only part you can control." He smiled and kept writing. "Fair enough." When we finished, he handed me a pen. "Sign here. This makes you the founder, majority owner, and CEO. My hand trembled as I wrote my name. Victoria L. Hayes. The letters looked unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else, someone I hadn't met yet. I sat back staring at the ink drying on the page. "That's it?" I asked. "That's it," Ethan said. "You just gave birth to something that's yours." I laughed quietly. Exhaustion and disbelief mixing in my chest. "Feels like I just signed my own life sentence?" He smirked. "You'll thank me when it starts paying dividends." Outside, the snow had begun again, light and steady. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching the folder of documents, watching the city lights blur against the flakes. The wind cut across my face, but it didn't sting the way it used to. For years, my name had been written under someone else's letterhead. That night, it stood alone. I whispered into the cold air, "I'm not anyone's daughter anymore." The traffic light turned green, washing the street in emerald glow. I took a step forward. I'm the one writing my own name on the paper now. By 2017, the sign on the glass door finally read Summit Dynamics LLC. It wasn't the kind of sign that turned heads. No gold lettering, no fancy logo, just black text on frosted glass. But every morning when I unlocked that door, it felt like the beginning of something that belonged only to me. The office was the size of a studio apartment. 4 desks, 2 computers that sounded like they were gasping for air, and a coffee machine that rattled every time it brewed. The walls were bare except for a corkboard covered in sticky notes. Deadlines, invoices, a single quote from Grace that I'd written in red ink. "Build it your way or someone else will tell you how." Eleanor Whitman joined that spring. She was 55, sharp as a blade, with the kind of calm that only came from surviving 30 years in corporate finance. The first time she walked in, she scanned the office and said, "It's small, but so was IBM once." She became the spine of the place. Numbers made sense to her the way air made sense to lungs. Within a month, she'd built an accounting system from scratch, negotiated lower rent, and convinced 3 of her former colleagues to invest. We hired 4 employees, 3 of them women fresh out of grad school. I hadn't planned it that way, but soon the office carried a rhythm I hadn't seen anywhere else open. Conversations shared credit, quiet resilience. There were no closed doors. No one raised their voice to be heard. One Friday afternoon, Grace visited. She stood in the middle of the room watching the team huddle over a whiteboard full of data flow diagrams. "You built this?" she asked, smiling like a proud teacher. I shrugged. "We're building. Still a long climb." She nodded toward the team. "They trust you, you know, because you make them feel safe." I paused, letting that sink in. "I just don't want anyone here to have to bow to be respected." Grace's smile softened. "Then you're already leading better than most men I've met." She left soon after, and her words stayed with me longer than I expected. By autumn, we landed our first major contract, a Midwestern manufacturing group that needed a logistics overhaul. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on. The team celebrated with takeout noodles and a cheap bottle of Prosecco. I remember standing by the window, looking out at the Boston skyline, thinking maybe finally we were moving beyond survival. Then the email came. It was late, the office empty except for me and Eleanor. I was clearing out my inbox when I saw it. Subject line, Logistics Partnership Inquiry. The sender, Richard Hayes, Hayes Manufacturing, Inc. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My hand froze on the mouse. It felt like the air had turned heavy. Eleanor looked up from her desk. "Something wrong?" I clicked the email open. A polite request for consultation signed with his name at the bottom. Just his name, but it hit me harder than I'd expected. "Nothing's wrong," I said quietly. "Just ironic." She peered over her glasses. "That ironic face of yours looks personal." I smiled faintly. "You could say that. Fate really does have a sense of humor." The next morning, I forwarded the email to Ethan. His reply came within minutes. "You sure you want to touch this?" "We can decline quietly," I typed back. "No. I want it. Because this time he'll be the one who needs me." The meeting was set 2 weeks later. Ethan flew in from Chicago for it. Eleanor prepped the presentation while I rehearsed every line until my voice sounded like glass, smooth, strong, unbreakable. We met at a neutral site, a downtown conference center near the harbor. I wore a gray suit, hair tied back, no jewelry except a simple watch. I wasn't dressing for nostalgia. When Richard walked into the room, I felt the years collapse in on themselves. He didn't recognize me right away. Why would he? To him, I was a shadow, long erased. He shook my hand. "Ms. Hayes," he said, glancing at the name badge. "Any relation to—" "None," I interrupted. "Hayes is a common name." Ethan hid a smirk. We sat through the meeting, reviewing projections, automation designs, delivery metrics. Richard nodded approvingly at every slide. "You've done your homework," he said finally. "Efficient? Smart? I like efficiency." "Thank you," I replied, steady. "It's something I learned from watching others waste time." Eleanor kicked me lightly under the table. When the meeting ended, he signed the preliminary contract. His pen scratched across the paper with authority, the same way it always had when I was a girl watching from the corner of his office. I took the pen next. The moment my ink touched the page, our names met in the middle. R. Hayes, V. Hayes, father, daughter, two signatures crossing like parallel lines that had finally decided to meet. Ethan gathered the documents, sealing them neatly into a folder. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "That's your biggest client yet." I stood by the window as they left, looking down at the harbor below. The sunlight glinted off the water, turning the waves gold. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then, softly, almost to myself, "He built a company that ignored me. Now it depends on me to survive." Eleanor turned off the lights, her voice warm behind me. "Fate's a funny accountant, isn't it?" I smiled faintly. "No, it's just punctual." The office door clicked shut, and I stayed there watching the harbor until the sun disappeared. The papers on my desk still smelled of ink and salt air, like something freshly claimed. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about revenge or approval, only balance, and maybe somewhere deep down the start of a quiet reckoning. By 2018, the cracks in Hayes manufacturing were visible to anyone who knew how to read a balance sheet. Rising production costs, outdated equipment, and a market that had long outgrown my father's stubborn methods. It was all coming apart, one quarterly report at a time. Andrew had stepped into his role as chief financial officer, the golden boy in tailored suits repeating every phrase my father once used. Short-term loss for long-term control. He told investors even as their numbers bled red. I saw the reports. Our systems handled their logistics now. The irony wasn't lost on me. By late 2020, word reached Boston through industry channels Hayes Manufacturing was considering selling. For me, it wasn't just business. It was symmetry. Lena Foster called me the same week. "Boston suits you," she said over the phone. Her voice still carried that Manhattan crispness, all charm wrapped around calculation. "Depends on what you're selling," I replied. "I'm not selling. I'm brokering," she said. "I've been approached by an older company in Chicago. Hayes Manufacturing. They're looking for a buyer with capital and a clean record. My contacts believe Summit Dynamics fits that profile perfectly." I leaned back in my chair, my hand gripping the phone a little tighter. "And you didn't think that might be—" "Complicated business doesn't have room for complicated," she said too quickly. "It has room for profit. You're expanding. They're desperate. It's a win-win." Her tone made me smile. "Then broker it, Lena. But keep my name out of every file you touch." "I always do," she purred before hanging up. I didn't trust her. But I didn't need to. In Chicago, my father was holding meetings with his board. The conference room in his downtown office still had the same mahogany table I used to stare at as a child, tracing the grain with my eyes, while the men around it talked about things I wasn't supposed to understand. "Hayes, manufacturing needs liquidity," Andrew said, flipping through a stack of reports. "We can't keep up with labor costs and distribution inefficiency. Selling is strategic, not surrender." Richard frowned, the lines on his face deeper than I remembered. You think I'll let outsiders gut what I built? No. I'll sell, but I'll dictate the terms. Andrew smiled the way he always did when he thought he'd won. We'll find a partner who respects your legacy. Legacy. My father repeated, testing the word like a coin between his teeth. Make sure we get what it's worth. When Lena Foster entered the picture, she played her role perfectly. Polished, confident, dressed in winter white cashmere. Summit Dynamics has a strong infrastructure, she told them, projecting numbers across the screen. They're expanding into Midwest manufacturing integration. Their offer is competitive. How competitive? My father asked. $98 million, Lena said. Full acquisition. No restructuring clause for the board. You'll exit clean. He nodded, satisfied. I know what I'm doing, he told Andrew that night over scotch. This will be a good deal for both of us. Andrew grinned, believing every word. Meanwhile, in Boston, Ethan stood in my office holding a folder. It's official, he said. Delaware Holdings transferred the capital into the escrow account. Every document trails back to Summit, not you. Eleanor looked up from her desk. Half glasses perched on her nose. We just need his signature. I nodded, scanning the details. Every clause, every transfer. Clean, untraceable, legal. Ethan hesitated before speaking again. If Lena figures out who's behind this, she could blow the deal. She's not loyal to anyone but money. I looked at him calm. She can try. I'm done hiding behind initials. He studied me for a moment. You're sure about this? I exhaled slowly. Completely. For once, the paper will do what I could never make him do. Listen. The day of the signing came like any other Thursday in Chicago. My father walked into the conference room with the quiet authority of someone who still believed the world owed him obedience. Lena stood by the projector, reviewing final figures. Everything looks good, Andrew said. This is the right move. Richard smirked. The right move is knowing when to fold and still look like you're winning. Lena handed him a pen. Sign here, Mr. Hayes. Once this is executed, Summit Dynamics will take over operations effective immediately. He chuckled. I hope they know what they're buying. Across the country, the same set of documents sat on my desk in Boston. I ran my thumb along the embossed edge of the contract. The paper smelled faintly of toner and inevitability. Eleanor stood beside me, arms folded. Once you sign, there's no undoing this. That's the point, I said. Ethan waited at the end of the table, expression unreadable. It's poetic, you know, he said. He sells to you without knowing it. Poetry, I murmured, was never his language. Numbers were. We all fell silent. The only sound was the tick of the clock above the glass door. In Chicago, Richard Hayes scrawled his name with a flourish. Richard A. Hayes. His pen slicing through the page. There he said, done. In Boston, my hand moved across the same line, slower, steadier. Victoria L. Hayes. 2 signatures miles apart, bound by the same ink. I looked at the page, the 2 names that once belonged to a family and now belonged to an equation. Ethan exhaled. It's official. Summit owns Hayes Manufacturing. I sat back in my chair, the hum of the city faint through the windows. I didn't destroy him, I said quietly. He just handed me the match. Eleanor smiled, a small, tired smile. Then I guess it's time to decide what to burn. I looked out at the harbor, its surface calm under the late afternoon light. I didn't strike out of anger. I answered in the only language he respected. Precision. Somewhere in Chicago, he was pouring another drink, toasting what he thought was a victory. I closed the file, the sound crisp and final. The story wasn't finished, but the scales were starting to balance. By the start of 2023, the storm was already building. Quietly, methodically, like all things destined to break. It began in a glass tower off Madison Avenue where Lena Foster sat behind her desk, staring at a document that wouldn't leave her alone. Her assistant, a nervous young man named Jonah, hovered nearby. "You've been looking at that file for an hour," he said. Lena didn't look up. "Delaware Holdings," she murmured. "The shell company that wired $98 million into the Hayes escrow account." "Everything checks out," Jonah replied quickly. "Audited, clean, all corporate." She tapped her pen against the paper, her eyes narrowing. "Clean never means clean. Find me the board filings. I want to know who signed off on the capital transfer." Jonah hesitated. "That could take time." Lena smiled without warmth. "Then cancel your weekend." By the next morning, she had what she needed, or at least enough to make her pulse quicken. The trail wasn't obvious, but it existed 3 cross-registered entities, a consulting firm in Boston, and one familiar name buried deep in the registration data. She sat back, a slow grin forming. "Summit Dynamics," she whispered. "You clever girl." That afternoon, she called Richard Hayes. He answered with the same gruff tone I remembered from my childhood. "Foster, I hope you're not calling with bad news." Lena's voice was syrupy smooth. "That depends on how you define bad, Mr. Hayes. Tell me, are you absolutely sure you know who bought your company?" There was a pause. "A Boston logistics group," he said. "I saw the portfolio myself." She let out a quiet laugh. "Then maybe you should take another look. Sometimes the reflection in the glass isn't just your own." He bristled. "You're talking in riddles and I don't appreciate games." "Neither do I," she replied, her tone turning sharp. "That's why I thought you should know. Your buyer isn't what you think." He ended the call without saying goodbye. But that night he stayed awake long after Andrew left the office, staring at the city lights and replaying the conversation. Across the country, I met Grace for coffee by the Charles River. The air was crisp, the water a flat sheet of gray. Grace wore her usual wool coat, and the expression of someone who'd seen enough victories turn to ruins to know what came next. "You've been quiet lately," she said, stirring her espresso. "I've been working," I answered. "That's what people say when they're running from something." I gave a small smile. "You think I'm running?" Grace tilted her head. "I've seen people reach the top, and I've seen them swallowed by the same anger that pushed them there. You remind me of both kinds." "I'm not angry," I said. "I just remember—" She leaned forward slightly. "Memory is a dangerous substitute for peace." Before I could answer, my phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in years, Mom. "Margaret Hayes." I froze. The sound of the river faded behind the rush in my ears. Grace noticed. "You're not going to answer?" I stared at the screen until the call went to voicemail. "Not yet." She nodded slowly. "Then I hope you know why." I wasn't ready to hear her voice, because hearing her meant acknowledging what came after anger, something far harder to face forgiveness. When I returned to the office that evening, Boston was bathed in winter light. Cold, metallic, beautiful. Eleanor was reviewing contracts. Ethan was on a call in his office. The hum of computers filled the silence. I walked straight to the glass wall where the Summit Dynamics logo gleamed in silver letters. My reflection looked older than I felt. Stronger too, but somehow lonelier. I placed my hand against the glass. "They don't know where I fit in this story," I whispered. "But I do." Behind me, Eleanor said softly, "Something on your mind?" I turned slightly, just thinking about timing, how everything lands exactly where it's supposed to. She gave me that half smile she reserved for moments she didn't fully understand. "Timing's your favorite weapon." "Not weapon," I said. "Compass." Outside, snow began to fall. Slow, deliberate flakes drifting past the high-rise windows. The city below glowed in the fading light, each building humming with its own quiet agenda. Somewhere in New York, Lena Foster was pulling threads she thought would unravel me. Somewhere in Chicago, my father was pacing his office, realizing he might have just sold his empire to a ghost. And here I was watching my reflection in a pane of glass that held both names, his and mine, tied together by ink and history. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was chasing the past. I felt like I was walking ahead of it. I looked down at the streets of Boston, headlights sliding through the dark like veins of light. "They have no idea," I whispered. "But I do." I stayed there until the office lights dimmed automatically at 9, the logo fading into shadow while my reflection remained. The city outside was frozen silver. From my hotel window on the 32nd floor of the Hilton Chicago, looked like it was holding its breath. Snow drifting lazily under streetlights, Lake Michigan, dark and endless beyond. I stood there in a black suit, hair pinned back, the hum of the radiator low and steady behind me. 13 years. That's how long it had been since I walked out of this city with 2 suitcases and a heartbeat full of anger. And now here I was, back where it all began. Not for family, not for celebration, for closure. 13 years ago, I left Chicago with nothing. I whispered to the glass. Tonight, I came back to finish it. My laptop chimed on the desk. An email from Ethan. The subject line, "Final confirmation." I sat down, opened it, and read the first line. "Transaction confirmed. All holdings under Summit Dynamics. You are the sole CEO of record." The blue light of the screen painted across my face, pale and cold. The words didn't shock me. I'd been waiting for them for months. Still, something inside me tightened. The moment where theory becomes reality, where control stops being a goal and becomes a weight. A second message followed almost immediately. "Lena's in Chicago. Sources say she's been in contact with Richard. He might be getting suspicious. Proceed carefully tomorrow." I typed back 2 words. "Let her watch." I closed the laptop and leaned back. The room was silent except for the faint wind pressing it against the windows. On the desk sat a small box I hadn't opened in years. I reached for it, hesitating only a moment before lifting the lid. Inside, wrapped in a yellowing handkerchief, was a silver pen. The engraving was still sharp even after decades for my heir. A birthday gift from my father. I was 10. I rolled the pen between my fingers, its weight familiar and heavy. "Heir," I said softly. "He just picked the wrong gender." I set it down beside the folder on the desk. The memory came back with perfect clarity. The day I got that pen. It was summer. I was outside trying to ride my bike without training wheels. I remember falling hard, scraping my knee. Richard stood a few yards away, hands in his pockets, watching. Andrew ran over, frantic, helping me up. My father's voice cut through the afternoon air. "A girl should know how to keep her balance," he said. "Don't bother your brother." The sting in my knee had faded long before the sting in those words ever did. Back in the present, I picked up the pen again, twisting it until it caught the light. I placed it on the contract sitting in front of me. The one document that tied every string together. The company, the sale, the irony. The lamp on the desk cast a cold circle of light. The silver pen gleamed inside it like a small, perfect blade. I took a breath, steady and slow. My hand didn't shake when I signed. The sound of the nib dragging across paper was crisp and final. My name. Victoria L. Hayes, curved beneath the title line like an answer 13 years in the making. I looked at the signature for a moment, then leaned back, closing my eyes. Tomorrow, I won't be the girl they dismissed or the daughter they erased. I'll be the name on the paper, the owner of what he thought he still controlled. The wind outside picked up, tapping lightly against the window like a slow metronome. I opened my eyes and looked out over the city again. The skyline shimmered under the snowfall, and the traffic below moved like veins of red and white light. Down there somewhere, my father was probably finishing a glass of scotch, rehearsing the speech he'd give at Andrew's wedding. The speech about legacy success, the son who carried his name forward. He didn't know that by morning his legacy wouldn't belong to him anymore. The thought didn't make me smile. It just made me still. I picked up the pen again, felt its coolness against my palm, and placed it carefully back in its box. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered. Maybe stronger. Ethan texted once more before midnight. "You'll see him tomorrow. Keep it calm. I typed back, "Always." Then I shut off the lamp, leaving only the city's light spilling through the window. I stood there a while longer, watching the snow fall slow and deliberate over the skyline of the city that once sent me away. When I finally lay down, I didn't dream. I didn't need to. Tomorrow was already written in ink that could never be erased. Morning light poured through the glass facade of the Four Seasons, catching every diamond, every camera flash, every smile that was more performance than joy. The ballroom shimmered in gold and ivory. Waiters moved in perfect formation with champagne flutes, and a string quartet played something too cheerful for the December cold outside. The wedding of Andrew Hayes and Caroline Brooks had begun. The son of a business titan marrying the daughter of a senator. It was less a wedding than a merger of reputations. Reporters crowded the entrance, their lenses chasing the next headline, "Legacy Meets Power." My father was in his element. Richard Hayes, 70 now, but still sharp in his tuxedo, was shaking hands near the front of the room, his laughter booming over the chatter. "My son," he declared to a circle of guests, "is marrying into the kind of family that understands legacy. And me, I've just sold Hayes Manufacturing for $98 million. Tell me that isn't a perfect season." The crowd responded with admiring murmurs. The champagne flowed again. I stood at the back unnoticed at first until the ripple moved through the crowd. Heads turned. A whisper cut across the music. She came. Another voice followed, lower-edged with amusement. I thought she was banned from these things. I felt every stare but didn't return any. My steps were measured, deliberate. The black suit I wore didn't blend with the pastel silks and sequins around me. It wasn't meant to. I found a small table near the edge of the hall, just far enough from the stage to watch, but close enough to hear. My father saw me halfway through his toast. His expression didn't change, not at first. Then a smile flickered, one that didn't reach his eyes. And I see he said into the microphone, "Even those who left the family still know where home is." Soft laughter spread. He lifted his glass higher. "Tonight isn't just about love or marriage. It's about continuity. Andrew will carry forward the Hayes name and everything it stands for. As for me, well, after selling my company for $98 million, I'd say my work is done. Applause." He paused, his gaze settling directly on me. "And Victoria," he said, his voice dipping into that familiar condescension, "you're getting nothing. But you already knew that, didn't you?" The laughter this time was louder, bolder. Even the string quartet faltered before regaining their rhythm. Someone near me whispered, "Poor thing," as if pity were an act of generosity. I felt the sting, the same old wound, but it didn't bleed anymore. My hand was steady when I lifted my glass. The reflection of the chandelier trembled inside the champagne, sharp as cut glass. I stood. "Congratulations, Dad," I said, my voice even. It takes a certain kind of genius to sell something you no longer own. The room froze. Every eye turned toward me. My father blinked, his smile stiffening. "What are you talking about?" I took a slow sip before answering. "You might want to look over that contract again, because I think you sold the wrong company." Andrew laughed first too loudly. "Come on, Vic, don't ruin the party. You've had your little moment." I met his grin with calm. "You always did celebrate too early." The crowd had begun to murmur now, a low hum of confusion. Flashbulbs started to go off, sensing a story. From the far side of the room, Ethan appeared, blending in effortlessly among the guests. He wore a simple navy suit, nothing to draw attention until he reached the stage. "Mr. Hayes," he said clearly, handing over a folder for your records. "The finalized acquisition of Hayes Manufacturing." My father frowned, irritated. "What is this?" Ethan stepped back. "Public record, sir. The buyer you signed with was Summit Dynamics, the CEO and majority shareholder." He looked toward me. "Is Victoria Hayes?" The silence that followed wasn't really silence. It was the sound of everything stopping. The air, The music, the breath of 200 people holding still at once. My father stared at the papers, his eyes tracing the signature line, the embossed corporate seal, his own name written beside mine. Somewhere near the back, a reporter's camera flashed. Then another. The light caught on the sweat beginning to form at his temple. Andrew's face went pale. "That's not possible," he said half to himself. "She can't. Dad, tell them she can't." My father's voice came out low, almost hoarse. "What the hell is this?" I didn't move. "It's called a closed acquisition," I said. "Perfectly legal. Perfectly final. The company you bragged about selling wasn't yours to sell anymore." Someone gasped. The crowd began to murmur again, louder this time, voices blending into disbelief. The string quartet had stopped playing altogether. The only sound was the faint click of camera shutters. My father looked up at me, his face a mixture of anger and something else. Something like fear. "You planned this," he said. I met his stare. I executed it. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Andrew took a step toward me, his fists tight. "You don't get to humiliate him like this." Ethan stepped between us, calm as ever. "Careful, Andrew. There are cameras." It was true. Reporters had begun to gather near the stage phones raised, recording everything. My father turned toward the crowd, searching for a way to reclaim control, but the weight of the silence crushed his voice before it could rise. I lifted my glass one more time, my hand steady. "You built an empire, Dad. I just bought it back." He opened his mouth, but no sound came. In that suspended moment, with all eyes fixed on him, I realized the thing I had been chasing all those years wasn't revenge. It was acknowledgement. And I didn't need it anymore. The cameras flashed again, bright enough to sting. My father's hands trembled over the contract as if holding it tighter could change what was already written. The room felt airless, like everyone was afraid to exhale. I didn't have to shout to be heard. The truth was loud enough to echo on its own. I set my glass down on the nearest table, the sound of it meeting crystal, sharp and final. Then I turned and walked away, leaving the noise to swallow itself behind me. As the doors closed, I heard the first question shouted from a reporter. "Mr. Hayes, is it true your daughter owns the company?" And his silence was the answer. The room erupted before the silence could even settle. Voices crashed into each other, disbelief mixing with anger. Someone dropped a glass. It shattered, sharp and bright like punctuation. My father's face had drained of color. He stood, hands trembling, staring down at the contract as if the paper itself might rewrite its truth. "This is impossible," he muttered. "It's fraud. This is a setup." I didn't move. "It's not fraud, Dad. It's memory." He looked up, eyes narrowing. "What the hell does that mean?" I met his gaze steady. "You're the one who taught me how to read a contract line by line. You just didn't think I'd ever use it better than you." He blinked as if struck. Around us, the guests had drawn back instinctively, forming a circle. The orchestra had gone silent. Even the waiters stood frozen mid-step. Andrew pushed through the crowd, his voice loud and desperate. "She forged it. Summit is a foreign company. None of this is legal." Ethan stepped forward calmly, phone in hand. "Summit Dynamics is a Delaware corporation registered under UA law. Every transfer was verified and signed. 100% legitimate." Andrew turned on him. "You're lying. You're her puppet." Ethan's tone didn't change. "Check the state filings if you'd like. They're public record." My father's breathing grew uneven. He snatched the folder from Ethan's hand and flipped through the pages as if the ink might rearrange itself out of fear. His eyes were red now, raw with disbelief. Across the room, I saw my mother, Margaret, standing near the edge of the crowd, one hand on her chest. Her eyes shimmered, not with anger, but something softer. Something like grief. For a moment, I almost turned toward her. Almost. My father's voice cut through, again hoarse. "Who helped you do this? Someone must have fed you the details. These filings, these banks. No way you managed this alone." I took a slow breath. "That's where you're wrong. You raised me in boardrooms, remember? You wanted a son who could take over your company. You got a daughter who learned how to take it back." There was a murmur like wind sweeping through the crowd. Richard's hands tightened around the contract. He looked older suddenly, like the weight of all those years had found him at once. Then Ethan's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then held it up. "Mr. Hayes," he said evenly, "I think you should see this." He tapped the screen. An email opened on display. From Lena Foster. "I hereby confirm the successful closing of the sale between Hayes Manufacturing and Summit Dynamics." The message read, "As broker, I've verified the identity of both parties." Lena Foster. Gasps. Every sound in the room evaporated. Richard's jaw clenched. That woman! Behind him, Lena turned toward the exit, her heels clicking across the marble. She made it 2 steps before security moved to block her path. "Going somewhere?" Ethan asked quietly. Andrew lunged forward. You knew." Lena's tone was ice. "I worked for whoever paid the most. That's business, Andrew. You should have inherited that from your father." He shouted something. Indistinct, furious. But no one listened. Cameras were up now. Reporters, guests, even staff had their phones raised, capturing every tremor in my father's hands. I felt none of the triumph I thought I would. Just stillness. My father's voice came again, quieter this time. "You humiliated me." "No," I said softly. "I told the truth. The humiliation came from the lie you built around yourself." He sank into his chair, the folder limp in his grip. My mother stepped toward him, but he brushed her hand away. The lights seemed harsher now. The music equipment hummed idly in the background, the only sound left in the room. People whispered, their voices blending into a static murmur of disbelief. I turned my head, letting my eyes sweep across the hall. The chandeliers, the frozen smiles, the guests pretending they hadn't spent a decade praising the man now undone. They had it all. Light applause power. And I, the shadow in the corner, was invisible. Until tonight. The light finally shifted. My father looked up once more. "Was it worth it?" he asked. I held his gaze. Every signature. The words hung there, simple and irreversible. I glanced toward Ethan, who gave a small nod. The signal that everything that needed to happen had happened. As I turned to leave, someone started clapping. Hesitant, nervous. Then it stopped, smothered by the discomfort that filled the air. I didn't look back. I walked past the reporters, past the stares, the murmurs, the whispered pity. My heels clicked against the marble floor, steady as a metronome. The ballroom doors closed behind me with a soft, final thud. For a brief second before they sealed shut, I heard the faint echo of applause. 1 or 2 guests, maybe out of respect, maybe confusion. It didn't matter which. I kept walking. 3 weeks after the wedding, my name was everywhere. Headlines screamed from every screen and newspaper rack. The daughter who outsmarted her father. Corporate queen or cold-blooded heir. Each article dissected the story like it was fiction. Some praising me as brilliant, others calling me ruthless. The photographs told their own version. Richard Hayes, pale and furious, walking out of the Four Seasons ballroom. Me calm, detached, a champagne glass in hand. Frozen images of a private reckoning turned into public entertainment. I thought silence would follow, but my father wasn't done. He filed a lawsuit. The petition came through my attorney's office 2 days later. Richard Hayes versus Summit Dynamics, Inc. Claim fraudulent misrepresentation in contract. In other words, he was accusing me of deceiving him, of tricking him into signing away his empire. Ethan called as soon as he read the document. "He's not suing for money," he said. "He's suing to save face." "I know," I said, closing the blinds of my Boston apartment. The city outside glowed orange with late winter dusk. "He's trying to rewrite the ending." Eleanor called that evening, too. "If it goes to trial, it'll be public. He'll drag you through the mud." I sighed. He can try, but truth doesn't flinch. 3 weeks later, we met again. This time not in a ballroom, but in the marble hall of the Illinois Commercial Court. The press had gathered outside before sunrise, their breath fogging the cold Chicago air. Reporters shouted questions, cameras clicked, and the story everyone thought had ended was suddenly reborn under brighter lights. Inside the courtroom, the world felt smaller. The high ceilings, the hum of air vents, the weight of history in the silence between questions. My father sat across the aisle, his lawyer whispering in his ear. His suit was immaculate as always, but the sharpness was gone from his posture. Judge Amelia Brooks presided, gray hair pinned, tight eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Mr. Hayes," she said, voice steady, "this court has reviewed the contract and all supporting financial documents." She flipped a page, the sound crisp in the still air. "You signed the agreement voluntarily. The transaction was processed through verified corporate entities. Funds were transferred and cleared. Ownership of Hayes Manufacturing now legally belongs to Summit Dynamics." My father's lawyer tried to protest. "Your Honor, my client was not aware of the true identity of the purchasing party. That constitutes—" Judge Brooks raised a hand. "Ignorance is not fraud, counselor. Your client had full opportunity for due diligence." Her gavel struck once. Motion dismissed. Case closed. The room exhaled. Andrew, sitting behind my father, muttered a curse under his breath. His face was pale, his tie loosened. He avoided looking at me. Reporters were waiting when we stepped into the hallway. Their flashes hit like lightning. "Ms. Hayes, how does it feel to win against your father? Do you see this as revenge?" "Mr. Hayes, any comment? Do you regret signing the deal?" My father kept walking. He didn't answer a single question. A young reporter near the door called out louder than the rest, "Sir, do you have any regrets?" He stopped. For a moment I thought he might say something, but he just straightened his jacket and walked into the sea of cameras, disappearing down the courthouse steps. I stood with Ethan and Eleanor near the marble columns, the echo of voices bouncing off the walls. Ethan turned to me. "You did it." "No," I said quietly. "I just reclaimed what was already mine." He smiled faintly. "Semantics. Precision," I corrected. The three of us walked out together, the cold air biting at our faces. The reporters turned their attention elsewhere, chasing sound bites, moving on to the next headline. For them, this was just another corporate drama. For me, it was an ending I hadn't known I needed. Karma doesn't arrive in miracles, it keeps time. And when the clock strikes, it shows up right on schedule. A week later, the consequences rippled outward like aftershocks. The SEC opened an investigation into Lena Foster for insider trading. Her license was suspended indefinitely. Andrew's financial records were subpoenaed after an anonymous tip revealed hidden accounts linked to corporate misappropriation. One by one, the foundations my father built began to crumble. The last headline before the noise finally faded read, "Former Chairman Richard Hayes retires from finance citing health reasons." I watched the report on television from my apartment one quiet evening. The anchor's voice was neutral, detached. Once one of Chicago's most powerful industrial leaders, Hayes has officially stepped down from all executive positions. The segment cut to archival footage of him at a conference years earlier, smiling before a cheering crowd. For a second, I saw the man he used to be. The one who built, not the one who belittled. The screen shifted back to the anchor. Sources confirm that Summit Dynamics, led by CEO Victoria Hayes, will continue to operate the former Hayes facilities under its new brand. I reached for the remote and turned off the TV. The apartment fell into silence. The glow of the city outside spilled across the floor, soft and golden. I sat there a moment longer, the quiet hum of the heater filling the emptiness. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even proud. Just still. The fight was over, but the echo of it lingered somewhere deep, like a room you'd locked years ago but could still remember how it smelled. Outside, snow began to fall again over Boston, soft and slow, the kind that erased footprints before you could look back. The church bells in Evanston rang just as I pulled into the small parking lot. The sound carried through the spring air, slow and heavy, like the echo of something older than either of us. It had been months since the trial. Boston had thawed the snow long gone, and the world had moved on. But the past I was learning didn't follow the same seasons. The church stood at the edge of a quiet street lined with budding trees. Its stone walls were the color of time, soft gray, streaked with ivy. My mother was waiting on the front steps, her coat buttoned to the top even though the air was warm. In her hands she held a small bouquet of lilies, their white petals trembling in the wind. "Hi, Mom," I said softly. She turned at the sound of my voice. For a moment she just looked at me as if to make sure I was real. Then she smiled, a thin, uncertain smile that carried more apology than warmth. "You came. I said I would," I replied. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. We stood there for a long moment, two strangers sharing the same blood and too many years of silence. Then she gestured toward the church doors. "It's quiet inside. Let's sit." The wooden pews creaked under us as we settled. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and rain-soaked stone. Light poured through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across the floor, blue-red and a touch of gold. She placed the bouquet at the end of the pew, hands folded neatly on her lap. "Your father left Chicago," she said finally. Her voice was calm, too calm. "He sold the house. The papers said he retired, but I think he just ran out of things to fight." I nodded, staring at the sunlight shifting across the floor. "He always needed something to conquer. Even family." She hesitated. "I'm not here to defend him. I just wanted to tell you." Her voice wavered. "I'm sorry. For being silent. For watching and not speaking." I looked at her, trying to find anger, but finding only exhaustion. "Were you afraid of him or of losing him?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Both." The word hung between us, small but devastating. The clock above the altar ticked softly. We sat in its rhythm, letting the honesty settle where denial used to live. After a long pause, she spoke again. "You did what I never could, Victoria. You stood up to him. You didn't let his power define you." I shook my head slowly. "I didn't win, Mom. I just stopped playing his game." Her gaze softened. She reached out and placed her hand gently over mine. "Don't let the anger stay with you. It takes up space meant for peace." I looked down at our hands, hers smaller now, frailer than I remembered. For years I had imagined this touch as something that could never find me again. "I'm not angry anymore," I said quietly. "I found peace, but not in winning. Just in realizing I didn't need to." Her eyes shimmered, but she smiled. "That's more strength than any court victory." We sat there as the sun shifted higher, the light warming the wooden pews. Somewhere outside, a child laughed. It was faint, but real. The kind of sound that cut through the stillness, like grace. "I used to think you hated him," she said after a while. "But maybe what you hated was how much you wanted him to see you." I felt something break quietly inside me. Not pain, not regret, just the release of a truth too long carried. Maybe I said, "But wanting him to see me was just another way of giving him power." She nodded. "Then I'm glad he can't take that from you anymore." We didn't speak for several minutes after that. The quiet wasn't heavy now. It was almost kind. When she stood, I followed. Together we walked down the aisle toward the open doors. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain and lilies. She stopped on the last step, turning to face me. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. I met her eyes. "I don't think either of us needs it anymore." Her lips trembled, but she nodded. Then, with a kind of resolve I hadn't seen in her before she took my hand. Not as a mother holding her child, but as two women who had finally stepped out of someone else's shadow. We walked together down the stone steps and onto the street. There were no tears, no dramatic goodbyes. Just the faint rustle of her coat in the wind and the slow rhythm of our footsteps finding the same pace. At the corner, she stopped. "You look more like yourself now," she said softly. I smiled a small, honest smile. "Maybe I finally am." She touched my arm gently, then turned and crossed the street, her figure growing smaller against the light of the afternoon sun. I watched until she disappeared around the corner. Very saw. The church bells rang again, softer this time, and I stood there listening until the sound faded into nothing. The past, it seemed, had finally found its ending. 3 months later, the sun hung low over Boston, pouring gold across the skyline like the city itself was exhaling after a long storm. From the 40th floor of Summit Dynamics, the world looked different. Clearer, quieter, finally balanced. The boardroom was bright sunlight spilling across polished glass. I stood at the head of the table, hands resting on a stack of new proposals. Eleanor sat to my left, glasses low on her nose, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Claire scrolled through the presentation slides, her energy infectious. Ethan leaned back in his chair, calm as always, and Grace, elegant and steady, watched me with that familiar look of quiet pride. I took a breath and began. Our domestic division has exceeded every projection this quarter. It's time to take the next step. I glanced at the map on the screen behind me, dotted with new territories. Europe. We're expanding operations across the Atlantic. London, Berlin, and Amsterdam. But not just for profit. They listened, eyes sharp, the hum of ambition filling the room. We'll build what Hayes Manufacturing never did, a company that grows without crushing anyone beneath it. Transparent, humane, ethical. I caught my own reflection in the glass behind them. Not the girl who used to flinch at her father's voice, but a woman who had learned to use her own. We'll be global, I continued, but we'll never forget what it means to be decent. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Eleanor started to clap. The sound spread slow and genuine until the entire room joined in. It wasn't the applause of victory. It was something cleaner, calmer. When it faded, Grace leaned forward, her voice warm and low. You've come full circle, Victoria. I smiled, shaking my head. No, I said softly. Oh, I've just started a new one. She nodded, satisfied. Then make it a good circle. I turned toward the window. The city below glowed under the fading light, its buildings painted in orange and gold. Somewhere in that maze of streets, my story had started. And somewhere down there, it had ended. On the table beside me, the silver pen lay where I'd left it. For my heir. The engraving caught the light just right, gleaming against the dark wood. I picked it up, feeling the familiar, cool weight in my hand. I opened the final file in front of me, our international partnership agreement, and signed my name with that same pen, Victoria L. Hayes. The sound of the nib against paper was smooth, certain like a door closing behind me for good. He taught me that power was everything, but peace lasts longer. I set the pen down and looked out again. Boston was shifting from daylight to dusk, each skyscraper catching fire in the sunset before fading into silhouette. The city was alive, restless, unapologetic, just like me. Miles away, I imagined my father sitting by the lake, the same one where he used to take us as children. In my mind, he held a newspaper. The headline, Bold and Merciless. Summit Dynamics announces European expansion under CEO Victoria Hayes. Maybe he frowned. Maybe he smiled. Or maybe he simply read it and said nothing. For the first time, I realized I didn't need to know, because whatever he felt, anger, regret, pride, it was no longer mine to carry. The office was quiet again. My team chatted softly as they gathered their things. Eleanor closed her laptop. Grace slipped on her coat. Ethan caught my eye and gave a nod that said everything words didn't need to. I stayed a little longer watching the light fade. The reflection in the window stared back, strong still and finally whole. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was proving anything. I was simply living. If someone once told you you'd never be enough, smile, because they just gave you the reason to become more. I turned off the lights, letting the last of the sunlight spill through the glass one final time before it disappeared. The pen still glinted on the table as I walked out, a small silver reminder of everything I'd survived and everything I still had left to build. If you've ever been underestimated, If someone ever looked at you and said you couldn't, tell me how you proved them wrong. Because maybe your story isn't finished yet.